right. Hello, everyone. I am here with Gnostic Informant. I'm very excited about this conversation. Neal, how you doing today?
Good. I'm glad to be on here and excited about this too.
So before we get going talking about Nietzsche, I know we want to talk about philosophy in the tragic age, maybe a little bit about birth of tragedy. I'm kind of interested from watching a lot of your videos over the years. You delve into a lot of ancient texts and philosophy, religion, and myth in a way that goes beyond the surface level reading. You've talked to so many different experts, some of whom have unorthodox or innovative
Mm.
interpretations. And I guess I'm just wondering, first and foremost, could you maybe tell the audience who aren't familiar with you kind of how you would describe your mission statement and what you do? And adding on to that, what you feel you've kind of learned or gathered over the years doing this.
Yeah, man. So I started my channel in 2021. So it's coming up on 4 years now for my channel. And it was after a period of time, after a couple of years of me being a Christian myself, leaving Christianity, and then sort of like flirting with other sort of heresies and Gnosticism and stuff like that, digging into scholarship, reading a bunch of academic books on these subjects, and then starting my YouTube channel to interview people, but also make content on, the things that I'm passionate about. So I have like little mini documentaries and I have interviews, I have live streams, all types of stuff on my channel. And my mission statement, I guess I would say, is to sort of bring awareness to certain things that are not known, but are well established in not just academia, but like even on the fringes. Some good arguments, I think, from people on the fringes, and I try to bring them to the forefront. I think you nailed it. I mean, you said some of them are bona fide experts, and others are more, what did you say, creative
Yeah,
or
or innovative, you could say,
yeah. That's
alternative.
that's exactly what I'm going for. I'm trying to get different. I'm not just trying to be like it's got to be peer reviewed by this many scholars, and it has to be. I want to get those guys on, and I want to hear like what the stone cold consensus is. But I also want to get other people's sides who are, maybe they were a professor that got fired 10 years ago for being too extreme. And I want to get
Right.
those guys on, So I'm trying to be all over the place in what I'm trying to cover. But basically, it's early Christianity. I guess the hot spot that I study is like anywhere between 500 BC and 500 CE. That 1,000 year
Mhm.
period. That's where I'm stuck in. That's where I'm looking at. I'm looking at the growth of Christianity. I'm looking at the spread of Hellenism. I'm looking at the origins of the Torah and Judaism, stuff like that.
Yeah, and the way all those things relate too, which is very interesting that I've
Right.
kind of picked up on.
And you asked me too. One of the things I learned.
Oh, yeah, yeah, yeah.
One of the things that have really blown my mind on this journey is discovering that the Old Testament is not as old as we think. And this is one of the things that is like one of the major topics on my channel recently, and I'm going to explore it more. Is that when we all grow up in Western civilization, wherever you are, you're Baptist, you're Catholic, whatever you are, we all had this presupposition. It's this like axiom that we're all taught is like the Old Testament was this old, the Genesis and the Torah and Moses are these ancient scriptures that go all the way back to the Bronze Age, basically, and they're the oldest text and all. And then the Greeks came later, and then everyone got Hellenized, and then Christianity came along. It's actually that chronology is wrong. The Greeks are the beginning of everything. The Greeks are the big literary people who start all the writing and all the Homer. It starts with Homer and Hesiod, and then the playwrights. And we talked about Aeschylus before we recorded, Euripides. And then in that period of time, nobody, I mean, zero people are ever citing Moses. Nobody's mentioning Abraham. Nobody's mentioning Jacob. Nobody's mentioning Joshua's conquest. Nothing from the Old Testament is cited or mentioned by anyone, not just in Greek sources, but any sources, and Egyptian sources, Babylonian sources, Vedic sources, whatever. Nobody's talking about anything from the Old Testament until after 300 BC or right around 300 BCE.
I that was mind blowing for me. I saw some of that on your channel. What was particularly fascinating to me was Elephantine and the
Yeah.
Jewish population living there, and the fact that they seem to have no idea. They don't seem to be following the Torah. They seem to be like even syncretizing Yahweh with pagan gods.
Yes, and more academics are coming out and writing peer-reviewed articles and books on this subject of, okay, we found this city, Elephantine. It got dug up, I don't know, like 100 years ago or something. And they've been meticulously going through the Aramaic papyri that they found there. The Jewish community that populated this city of Elephantine, which is an island all the way down south in Egypt, near like the border, I think, of Sudan, I think, so all the way down there. But it's far deep into Egypt. We know that they got there between 597 and 586 BCE. So it's a perfect time capsule. There's not much they could know after that, but there's nothing that can they should have knowledge of things before that, is what I'm saying.
Right.
But okay, and they lived there all the way until 400 BCE, and they're writing letters back and forth to Jerusalem. They're very literary. They have psalms, they have proverbs, they have not the ones in the Bible, different ones. They have and they're like writing psalms to like Horus and Isis and Yahweh. And then you're like, okay, they call themselves Jews too, Judaios. They call themselves Jews. So they're Jews. They call themselves Jews, and out of the thousands, they found thousands of between Aramaic papyri fragments or just inscriptions on stone or steles or whatever. If you add up all the texts that we find, all the data, there's over 1,000 texts. None of them mention Moses. None of them mention Abraham. None of them mention Noah. No Adam and Eve. No Jacob. No 12 tribes. No nothing. And this is, if you look at the timeline, if anyone's wondering, this is well after the Torah is supposed to be well known. Because you read Kings and Chronicles, there's like this whole entire back and forth between the good kings and the bad kings. And Josiah made reforms and he brought the Mosaic laws back and made everything good again. And this king came in and he made everything bad again. But this is supposed to be after that. So this
Right.
makes no sense.
Yeah, that was particularly mind blowing to me to learn that. Something that's complementary to that insight is that these aspects of the Old Testament, or maybe even the Old Testament itself, is not as old as we think it is. On the other hand, another thing I found in your channel that I found very interesting was the influence of Hellenism on the New Testament.
Yes.
And so the fact that what I'm saying, though, the reason why that's sort of a complementary maybe insight or observation is that it seems like it would completely flip the way that we see the heritage that leads to Christianity,
Yeah.
just the way that we understand it, right?
Yeah.
Because even Jewish people are also being affected by Hellenization.
Yeah. There's plenty of scholars who are pointing out that, or Russell Gmerkin's written books on this about Plato's Timaeus and how Plato interprets the demiurge, the god, the theos, as this sort of perfect, all-knowing, was there in the beginning, creates everything from himself, and people connect that to Genesis and going, wait a minute, there's not anything like this. Like even in the most henotheistic cultures, they didn't really have this sort of way of thinking of God like this. This is very Platonic that we find in Genesis. Not only that, the pre-Socratics, some of these pre-Socratics that are before Plato have very much similar ideas of the one, the monad, the hen, this sort of creator. The sometimes it's called the logos, sometimes it's called the nous, the mind, and then you find that in Judaism, and then later even more clear in Christianity, like in John's Gospel, the logos, definitely.
Right. Which is very fascinating to me because it seems to almost be if that's true, that's a vindication of Nietzsche's position that Platonism has this direct link to Christianity, that you can see
Absolutely.
Christianity as an outgrowth of Platonism.
Absolutely. He was spot on. And I don't I when I read him, I always wonder, did he see what these scholars today are seeing? Because and I think it's in the Antichrist where he talks about like how he talks about like he basically like says like this all these scriptures are all lies. Like they're all just made up. Like I almost wonder is like, did he, because he's a philologist. People don't real well, you know this. Most people, Nietzsche fans know this. A lot of people don't know. They think of Nietzsche as a philosopher, right? Which he is. But like first and foremost, he's a philologist who's studying ancient text. So
Right.
you have to wonder, did he run into this problem that I'm running into, and scholars today are running into, looking at the Old Testament and going, wait a minute, is there some sort of noble lie happening here that we find in Plato's Republic? Is that what it seems like that was what he was getting at? Like you're saying, it vindicates his work a lot.
Well, right. Well, that he sees kind of the thread that you identified, that there's nothing really that we could compare Platonism to in terms of this like intelligible world of the forms and the otherworldly, the divine realm is the realm of the idea. Another group that I wasn't really familiar with are this early sect, the Carpocratians.
Mm,
Could you speak a little bit about them, just so people who don't know,
yeah,
because they venerated Plato and Pythagoras and Jesus, if I understand correctly.
yes. So what's so funny about this is when you look at early Christianity in the first century and early second century, up until the time of like Justin Martyr in the 150s, Christianity is a whole nother beast, not even recognizable to what it is today. It is completely, I don't know. It's more fragmented. People criticize Christianity today. They're like, oh my God, there's so many sects and denominations. Nobody can agree on anything. Actually, today, Christians, the thousands of denominations that are alive today, that are around today, agree on more than the early Christians did. So one of these denominations is the Carpocratians. We have sources on them. Carpocrates was the leader. Marcellina, I think that was his wife. I think it was his wife or one of the leaders of the church. And they had and he had a son named Epiphanes. They were around from the in Alexandria in Egypt during the late first century and early second century, and they claim to be followers of not just Paul, but of like Mark, and like they're claiming they're not like some group that are like bringing themselves in from the outside. They're claiming to be in the inside. They're claiming to be the apostles of the apostles. So they're not like outsiders. But their theology was completely foreign to what you would think today. They were more philosophers, and they thought of Jesus as another sage who attained what they called apotheosis. So they had this idea that every once in a while, a great sage will sprout up, and the muse would be, in this person's ear, and they're basically like they attain salvation through gnosis. And this is what they call apotheosis. It's the highest level of gnosis you can attain, where you literally can think like God. So you're deified. They actually build temples to you. And the reason why I mentioned Epiphanes, the son of Carpocrates, when he died at age 17, but this kid was deified, and they had we found a temple that they built to him on Kefalonia, an island in Greece. But their theology was that there are all these great saviors from not just the Old Testament, not just the prophets like Isaiah and Hosea and Micah, but also the Greeks, Plato, Pythagoras, Aristotle. Who else did they name? They name a few of them: Aristotle, Pythagoras, Plato. I think there was one more that they named from the Greek side, but they throw Jesus. They had statues of Jesus, images of Jesus, and this was back before images was even a thing. Because at this point in time, Christianity was still under a lot of the Jewish ideas of like no graven images, no graven images. But they were like, nah, f that. We like graven images. We're Greeks. We're Hellenists. So they were making images of Jesus and making images of Plato and Pythagoras, and then we actually have Epiphanes text that he left when he was a young teenager. He wrote his own republic. It's called the Republic, his own version of it, and it's really deep and philosophical, but it's weirdly communist.
Mm.
Like this kid was like, all are equal under heaven. All animals are equal to humans, and there's no difference between animals and humans. No difference between male and female. There's no difference between rich and poor. It was like completely communist. This guy's thinking, If anyone wants to look that up, you can look up Epiphanes on Justice or Republic, and you'll see for yourself. I don't know. For lack of a better term, I say communist.
Right. I mean, some would argue that strain is already there in Plato's Republic to some extent,
Yeah.
or in some of Jesus's more radical statements in the gospel.
Right.
But yeah, what a lot of this sort of makes me think of is if there is this link between Platonism to Christianity, if that's like a real historical phenomenon, there's something really interesting Nietzsche says about the Epicureans and Epicurus and their opposition to what he calls like the subterranean cults. And what he means are basically any cults of revenge, as Nietzsche would describe it, or people who are starting these cults where they talk about, the judgment of your immortal soul after death.
Right.
And that the Epicureans have this, Epicurus famously says that, we can't really know whether the gods are real or not. You should behave piously as though they are,
Right.
just to give yourself peace of mind. Everything really, his entire philosophy can be seen as material and sort of working off working off Democritus and basically looking at things from, frankly, almost a utilitarian or consequentialist style lens. Anyway, there's a passage from Nietzsche where he's sort of lamenting the fact that, towards the late Roman Empire, all of the Roman aristocrats are becoming Epicurean. And then at that moment, that's when, the gospel and Christianity takes over. But what he says, what the Epicureans were combating in the old world or the world before Christianity was really quote unquote Christianity in a latent form. That basically all of the things that he sees as wrong with the historical Christian religion, resentment and the bad conscience and the ascetic ideal, were already present in these Greek cults, of like maybe the early Pythagoreans or people like that, long before Christianity comes along. And so it's just interesting because some people will interpret Nietzsche as if he's only talking about like the narrow historical instantiation. But one of the things I find most fascinating about him is how he will identify these phenomena that almost become like trans-historical in some ways. That they're, Christianity, quote unquote, that thing that he's opposing isn't limited to the religion that's founded by Jesus and Paul, but is actually something that he sees as pre-existent within, in fact, Greek society before Christianity.
And then it's funny you mentioned that because Nietzsche also differentiates the old Dionysian, which is the Homeric age, like classical period Dionysus, from the later Orphic Dionysus. And the later Orphic Dionysus, there's this entirely new theology that Dionysus was the heir to Olympus, and that when he was born, his name was Zagreus, and which means like life. And when he was born, the Titans tore up his body and ate him. And this angered Zeus. And by the way, what's interesting about that is in the Garden of Eden story, which is like prehistory, it's primeval history. They eat the fruit of life. Or they eat the fruit of knowledge. I mean, but in this particular case, it's primeval history, but they eat the fruit god of life. He's like god of fruit and life. It's interesting. I always thought, I wonder if that's like a parallel that I'm just seeing, or if there's something in there. But anyways, Zeus gets angered and he starts a deluge and he kills all the Titans. He just wipes them all out in a quick little stroke, floods the entire cosmos, starts over using the bodies of the Titans to create the world with, which, because they ate the flesh of Zagreus, that made it so that humans were born with half soul, Dionysus, and half body, which was Titan flesh. So this whole entire body and soul dualism thing that you find in Judeo-Christianity, mostly in Christianity, is actually very much apparent in Orphism and this whole new paradigm of Hellenistic Orphism. And what's interesting about that is in Alexandria, Egypt, where Christianity basically is thriving in the first century and second century, they actually found pseudepigrapha sources from Judeo-Christians writing in the name of Orpheus. And not only that, in the oldest catacombs in Italy, the one from the 3rd century, has Orpheus painted on the walls right next to Jesus. So that's
Oh wow.
is is it like Orphism and Judaism are marrying each other to create Christianity? Plus, with obviously like with the Middle Platonist backdrop that's influencing everything. Is that what's going on? That's what I'm wondering.
Well, there's also, correct me if I'm wrong on this, but it's largely with the Orphics that Dionysus kind of gets a soteriology, right? Where he
Yes.
is a savior figure. And that's where a lot of people draw that connection between Dionysus and Jesus.
Not only that, in Orphism, the Orphics were the first people to come along and start this whole idea of if you believe what we believe, you'll attain salvation when you die.
Mhm.
Before that, nobody did that. No, everybody was just you just attended your local cults and you were a part of a ancestry of religion, and it wasn't about faith. It wasn't about if I believe this, then I'll get this. The Orphics put that on the map. They started that idea, and they had this idea that if you buried the dead with a golden tablet attached to their neck, like a chain with a little letter on it, with a special code on it that cries out to Dionysus. And we found hundreds of these things. They're called like death passes. They basically a lot of them are like crying out to Dionysus to save me, let me come with you into Elysium. Yeah, he's the savior god in Orphism. He's like their Christ, you know?
Yeah, that's a really great point that there is a period of religion that's probably a far longer stretch of human history when what's going on in your heart isn't as important as ritualized behaviors,
Right.
offerings, adhering to a code of rules and taboos,
Right.
and honoring your ancestors and these things. I mean, you could
Absolutely.
deep down be like, fuck my ancestors, but as long as you're pouring out libations for them, saying the right prayers and chants, it doesn't like your actions in some way are more real than whatever it is that you're concealing in your heart. Have you ever read Fustel de Coulanges, The Ancient City?
No, I haven't.
That work really changed that, or it was just sort of a light bulb moment for me because of how he just points out that all these Greek cults, it was very important in the sort of, I guess, period. He's trying to inquire into like archaic Greece in a way of it was really important that you said the ritual chant at the sacrifice the exact same way that it had always been said
Right.
because you learned that like in a way it's almost like you could think about it almost empirically like okay, this is what works and so you should preserve it exactly the same way. Whereas like that's so foreign from modern day Christianity, where we would say like even if you don't do everything perfectly, you kind of confess your sins and God will understand or something like that.
Right.
Even with Egyptian religion, they have the weighing of the heart and the afterlife and all of that. That sort of judges your actions in life, but it's still not really based on like how good of a person you are, or whether or not you're the detail of the death pass of crying out for Dionysus. That really reminded me of I've even seen modern day like evangelical Christians talk about.
Yep.
At the moment of death, you need to be, calling out for, the blood of Jesus to,
And,
you
and
know,
they even had a secret code that the initiates of the mysteries would know for when they got to the underworld. They would go into the underworld, and if you knew the secret code was something along. It was in Greek, obviously, but it was something along the lines of, "I am a son of Stari Aranos and Gaia," which means heaven and earth. I am initiated into the Orphic mysteries, and please give me water. It's something along those lines. Don't quote me exactly, but and then so what would happen is they told you would see water, but don't drink the first water you see. That's for the people who aren't initiated. That's going to wipe your memory out. That's called the lake of memory or something like that.
or a Leith or
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Leti or
Like
something.
forgetfulness. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Forgetfulness. The second lake, that's where you got to drink. So there was all these like secret codes and passwords of how to get through the underworld if you found yourself there. But it's funny, you mentioned how the weighing of the heart thing too. And that's actually spot on of some of the roots of this stuff because Algis Uzdavinus is an old scholar. He died in 2010. He was like very much like a Jungian type of scholar. He's a really good scholar of religion, and he points out that he thinks the Orphics were influenced by that particular Greek, or I'm sorry, Egyptian religion. Yeah, that's what he
Hmm.
thinks.
Yeah, well, and that's sort of the funny thing about this is that I believe it's in Nietzsche's notes. I think it's in his unpublished notes where he makes that allegation about Plato that Plato studied with the Egyptians.
Yeah.
Nietzsche is really aware of all of the sort of cross pollination in the Greek world, which is very commonplace in like contemporary scholarship. But I think
Right.
it was kind of cutting against the grain for philology at the time
Oh
because
yeah.
people didn't want to necessarily like one of the things Nietzsche says in his lectures on the pre-Platonics, as he calls them, is that Thales was probably a Phoenician. That there were all these sort of people from all over the Mediterranean world influencing Greece, and
Yep.
so yeah, he also attributes that he calls it Egyptianism, this idea of the immortality of the soul and the judgment of the soul after death, and how different that was, not only from the sort of what would you say ancestral worship and understanding of sort of like the chain of being, according to the old, like, sort of hearthfire ancestor worship, land worship religions almost.
Right.
That's like really archaic Greece and Italy. It's also very different from the philosophies like Epicureanism.
Yeah, Plato in his Republic in book 3, he really makes it clear that there shouldn't just be one place for everybody to go called Hades. Like the idea he literally says in book 3 that the idea that Achilles, our great warrior fighter, this great famous icon, why should he be in Hades crying and lamenting about being he should be in a special place reserved for special heroes. And he comes up with this idea that Athenian children should be brought up knowing that they're going to be designated to a special place. He doesn't call it heaven, but it's heaven. He's basically saying that there's going to be a Hades for everyone and there's going to be a heaven for good people. So that you get this sort of heaven and hell thing in Plato right off the bat. I was going to say too, because Nietzsche criticizes this and Antichrist. I think it's Antichrist, pretty sure, where he says the heaven is right here. This world that we're in right now, this world that we're occupying, why should we wait to the next one to figure out when we're going to do all this great stuff? We have it right here. Why don't we make this our heaven? Why don't we get great right now? Why should we bank on the next thing if we don't even know what's going to happen after this? And that it's like he's just cutting right through the nonsense in some of this stuff that he writes.
Well, and you mentioned before actually the sort of the older, what Nietzsche would call the older Greekism versus the younger Greekism.
Yeah.
So older, the tragic age, as Nietzsche would call it. And I think kind of what you're tapping into there brings out what he sees as the difference. And I'm interested in kind of how you think about this, given like kind of your own personal philosophy about, the rise of the Greek philosophers in a way is sort of like a history of their decline. And that Socrates is sort of like he calls him like a world historical event, a turning point in world history where this theoretical way of approaching life comes to the forefront. Whereas Nietzsche would have said what he was kind of trying to recapture is the spirit of the older Greeks. He says they stopped at the surface and lived in appearance, and
Yes.
they were superficial out of profundity, and that they were so concerned with the outward, with the physique, with there was like a unity of inward and outward would be like another way of putting it, that they didn't learn. He talks about in Use and Abuse of History for Life that the way we have education is sort of accumulating these trivial facts that don't actually get integrated into our lives. And that this would have been seen as sort of like, the Greeks would have seen it as like a manual for external culture for internal barbarians or something like that. And so it's interesting because that divide, also, you talked about Homer and Hesiod. One of the things that's interesting in the history of Greek religious reformers and philosophers is they almost all love to go and attack Homer and Hesiod, which is funny, and say that, the whole education of the youth by the artists and the poets and the playwrights is something that needs to be improved upon, in Plato's Republic. And Socrates kind of goes through and he says, where he thinks, he says when Homer has Odysseus call his heart to order and sort of pound his chest and say, "Be still, my heart, we've seen worse than this." That's a good, poetic expression because it models courage or something like that. But when we have all these stories of Zeus like committing infidelity and killing people wantonly, like that can't be our image of the divine, and so that can't be accurate. And then you also have stories about Pythagoras apparently goes down to the underworld and tells his followers, yeah, Homer and Hesiod are being tortured in Hades for
Yeah.
misleading everybody. And so I guess I'm just wondering, like, how do you think about that criticism of Nietzsche's? Because I have kind of mixed feelings on it, of like philosophy and the development of the theoretical as necessarily like heralding the doom of your culture, or sort of moving you away from like this like sort of like vital, very healthy way of just living this life. But I think there's something there to what he's
Yes.
saying.
Yeah. So he talks about how there's too much Socratic rationalism that basically leads to, I guess, the death of God in a way, like the death of life, like this idea of this drive to live that comes from the, obviously, and when he talks about birth of tragedy, this the Apollonian Dionysian balance, and too much Socratic rationalism sort of kills that force. So the pre-Socratics leading up to Socrates are not all, a lot of them are, not all of them, but a few, like Heraclitus says that Homer's book should be burned. But Heraclitus doesn't just diss the poets. He also says Pythagoras was a bumbling idiot. He was like a
Right.
version of
And
Nietzsche.
Orpheus, right?
Yeah, oh yeah. And
Yeah.
he criticized the
And he's like,
Dionysian.
and what does Hesiod know, saying that day and night were separately created?
Right. Yeah, exactly. It's like that's nonsense. That is, yeah. He was like an ancient Nietzsche in a way, just calling everyone out. But
Yeah.
you're right, there was this sort of divide between the philosopher class and this sort of poet tragic class that was happening. And so this is perfect. That I just popped in my head. I just thought of this. He compares Sophocles from the tragic age. Sophocles lived in the 5th century BCE to the later, who was it? Euripides, right? Yeah, Euripidean Socrates. Yeah, Euripides lived in the end of the 4th century.
Yeah, Socrates' favorite playwright, the only
Yes.
tragedy in Socrates would go watch.
Yes, because they lived at the same time. If you lived in Athens in the 400s, you probably could meet Socrates at while you're watching a play of Euripides. They lived right there in Athens during the same time, during the whole struggle between democracy and oligarchy, going back and forth. The 30 tyrants, back to democracy, back to this, back to that. That was probably one of the greatest times to live ever because of what was going
Right.
on.
You could
But
go to a symposium and hang out with Aristophanes, Socrates, Alcibiades. Like,
yeah,
it's just incredible.
exactly. Yeah. Well, so many legends that lived in the 5th and 4th century BCE. Now, he compares the tragic poets to the post Socrates poets that are adopting the Socratic, this the logos, the reason, too much reasoning. He points out that a lot of this stuff leads to sort of the downfall of the Apollonian Dionysian duality. And I think
Well, because it's
Christian,
not tragic anymore. Because what is it? There's something optimistic about rationalism, and he says Euripides' plays confines every human being within a limited sphere of solvable problems, or something like that. And it's also more realism. There's less grant. Like I would compare it to like Aeschylus's Agamemnon in the beginning of that play is just like this like vivid metaphors and imagery, but it's kind of like just swirling around. The chorus is just sort of like recounting all of these myths and legends, and it's
yeah,
kind of hard to even like find your footing or know what's even going on in the text. Versus you read a play by Euripides, and I actually like Euripides. I think Nietzsche is like way overdoes it in his criticism of Euripides. But one of the things is that it's more like a modern story. There's more like logic to it. That like Nietzsche, his criticism is that you kind of can't have tragedy. You can't have these stories where the hero meets his downfall in spite of how heroic he is, because it's
yeah,
just fated. In a rationalist world where no, like you should solve that. That's a problem that needs to be solved, basically.
that's exactly what I was trying to say. That was perfect. Just perfectly said it. Now, that sort of becomes the norm for the next 300 years in the Hellenistic period. Christianity sort of when it Christianity sort of puffs itself up as the more rational religion. Like we believe that these things really happened. That there really was a guy and he really lived in the flesh, and these are real things that you have to believe in. Whereas like the in the tragic age, nobody was going around saying like this had to have happened. If you don't think it happened, something really going to end up in hellfire. But like, so the sort of, it's ironic that rationalism would do that. Like,
Can I ask you something about that really quick?
yeah, yeah,
Because I think I've heard you talk about this, like the ancient view of myth was not really the view based like that we might have of evaluating religious claim based on its like objective truth. And a lot of
right.
people think of that as like a really modern or even postmodern way of looking at myth. Could you expand on that a little bit, or?
Yeah, no, the ancients were really way smarter than we give them credit for. The myth makers, they were called mythologers. That's what Aristotle calls them, mythologers. They were the most educated people. They were like the scholars. They were right. They weren't just writing random myths that were like little kids. They weren't. It wasn't just like Aesop's fables. These were like your source of all knowledge. This is where your source of not just geography or like political stuff, but also like the sciences. It was embedded with all these different layers of knowledge in these myths, and they sort of describe the world. They sort of describe, they're embedded with philosophy, the idea of eros and psyche, and what does that mean to you, what does that mean for the cosmos. There was this relationship between the myth and the poet and the person who was in listening to the poet. So it was a lot more abstract, and it was a lot more metaphorical than just like, here's literally what happened and your life depends on you believing that this actually happened. So like, and
Right.
it's, and as I was alluding to before, it's ironic that rationalism would actually lead to that. But we can see this happening a second time during the whole Protestant movements in the 15th and 16th century, where all of a sudden the Protestants were like deciding that like the texts are what matter. Like, did it literally say this? There was like this big movement happening in the 16th century, 15th century of the Protestants going back to the original Hebrew, going back to the original Greek, and becoming scholars of text and trying to figure out, what do the originals say? Well, no, the Catholic Church is wrong. The original says this, because they're thinking rationally. The rational mind is leading them to become more dogmatic. So
Yeah.
it's ironic that rationalism actually leads to more dogma, because the rational mind wants everything to make sense.
Yeah,
Whereas
that's Nietzsche's criticism of like Luther, and he kind of makes it a criticism of Germany in general.
they're
That
obsessed with it.
right, but it's like that's a really interesting dynamic you're bringing up is rationalism leading to dogmatism of like an overdose of reason leading to just swallowing like revelatory statements of faith in a way. But it is like you can see something like Calvinism, which I think is like borders on like an almost psychopathic kind of interpretation of Christianity,
Yeah.
but it's almost like a really cold logical deduction that they've almost like had to adopt in order to have this purity of thought to make a completely consistent, coherent, rational system.
Yeah, it's like they have everything to in order to that rationalism makes a theologian want to have everything sort of accounted for. Like, I have my whole worldview is accounted for, so it all makes sense, and all I just got to do is follow this now. Like, that is the death of God in a sense. That is like, what are we doing now? That where is the life? Where is the force event? Where what are we doing?
Well, that's also, Nietzsche, where he talks about the Renaissance period and kind of praises it for all the reasons that people usually criticize it. That,
Mm,
the popes are behaving like mafia dons, they're fathering illegitimate children, they're selling indulgences, they're like raising armies for ambitious land grabs.
yeah,
And one of the things Nietzsche says is life sat on the throne of anti-life, because that's how he sees Christianity ultimately.
right, right,
And
right.
that this was like a resurgence of the pagan spirit in some way. And I
It
know
was.
that's like an oversimplification, but I think he's like trying to be provocative to make a point there that like there is something about the maybe you could call it like a boys will be boys attitude or just people will be people attitude that is way healthier, that doesn't lead you to, like maybe the sort of a good example might be religious purity sought by like Thomas More, who burned a bunch of people for reading the Bible in English, versus Henry VIII, who's like kind of screwing around and, like it's not good that he killed his wives or whatever, but it doesn't lead him to like want to burn people for not interpreting the Bible. He's like looking to his religious advisors to say, hey, how can I get a divorce? How can we like creatively interpret this text? And so there's like something like about the immoralism of people who want to creatively interpret the text that almost makes it just more adaptable to the human condition or something like that.
And you see this in Judaism with these scholars of the Talmud that are like, okay, all right, what if you get into a situation where you're engaged in sexual immorality? Here's the protocol of how to get out of it and not be sinning. Like all it's like all these like things, like, oh, you have to pull out and then you have to not look at the woman and then walk away or something like crazy. Like that's all like stuff that you get in those. They're like it's like a rational way of thinking out of how to like fool God, I guess. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, yeah. I did all the right. I covered my ass somehow. And
Yeah.
selling indulgences is still that, but there's actually a really interesting remark Nietzsche makes about the Roman legal code, or I guess they're mores, where it's like, where I think where we get the term like a pound of flesh, where basically one of the things a debtor could, if you couldn't pay, is he would be like, well, give me some amount of his flesh to equal what the debt is owed. And Nietzsche's bringing that up to make a point, a very interesting point about how somehow the ability to cause pain to others is like a fungible like commodity, which is very odd, but it's like it has some sort of inherent value. And so he's kind of exploring that, like why that would be. But anyway, he brings up as an aside that in the Roman law, they said if somebody takes a little more flesh or a little less flesh than actually the law designated, let that be no crime. And what Nietzsche points out is like there's something that's really like kind of morbid and just like inhuman about having exacting standards for a punishment like that.
Yeah.
It's like it's a brutal sort of like ancient law for like how to handle these like debtor creditor relationships, but he sees like in that like wiggle room,
Yeah.
like that's like healthy to have
And
that.
you mentioned the Renaissance before, and this is a great point because that's exactly what did happen. If you look at I read a lot about, I've been reading a lot about the Renaissance lately. It's been like one of the main things that I've been looking into in the last year, 6 months to a year, is reading about like Petrarch and Machiavelli and Brumi and some of these scholars from the 13th to 15th centuries. All of them, what do they all have in common? They're all going back to the Greeks. All of them. They're all going back to Plato. They're all going back, or Cicero, maybe the Latins too. Like Petrarch talked about how he would read Cicero at night and he would imagine that he's resurrecting Cicero from the dead to talk to him like a seance. That's Petrarch. And he was obsessed with, he couldn't read Greek because he was a Latin Westerner. He didn't know Greek. He said that he would look at Greek and how beautiful the Greek was, and he would wish he could read it, but he would just look over the Greek words and look how cool it is. He was obsessed with Greek and he couldn't even read it. And then you have Machiavelli, who's like writing about I forgot what the name of this text. I have it over here somewhere. There's a text from Machiavelli where he writes about Roman religion, and he literally just comes out and says Roman religion was way more effective before Christianity. The Roman imperial cult had it figured out. They had it mapped out perfectly where they would. He basically goes on and on about how great Roman imperial cult paganism was and how Roman Christianity sort of, it was like just a downhill ever since then until his time. So they were, and then you get people like Plethon. Plethon lived in Constantinople right before the fall of Constantinople. He actually died the year before Constantinople fell. And this guy just straight up rejected Christianity, called himself a pagan, wrote about the Hellenic gods, and then he ended up being the guy who Medici funded, the first Medici funded, who started the first Platonic Academy in Florence. And that was the academy that gave us Machiavelli, or not Machiavelli, Michelangelo and Da Vinci. So like
Right.
people credit this guy who's a pagan for starting this academy that produced all these amazing artists that gave us the Renaissance. So that is exactly what happened in the Renaissance. I agree with Nietzsche 100% on that. And back to one thing that I wanted to say too is even before Christianity, you know what euhemerism is?
Euhemerism. No.
There was a third century BC Hellenistic Greek named Euhemerus, He's adopting this sort of rational approach to mythology that you find in Diodorus of Sicily, that you find in, I guess, Plutarch, what you can say was, yeah, Plutarch too. But Euhemerus starts this new trend where no longer are the gods and the stories about the gods going to be in like these primeval, Hesiodic, Homeric setting. Euhemerus retold the stories about Zeus as Zeus was a real king that lived on Crete, and Dionysus was a real prince, and all the gods were real people that lived in these and on Earth in history that were deified. And Diodorus of Sicily lives in this first century BCE. He picks up on this euhemeristic way of writing mythology. You could read the Bibliotheca. He wrote like hundreds of pages of mythology about like the life of Dionysus and how he traveled to India with his army and won all these wars. Then went back to Egypt and took over Egypt with his father Ammon, Zeus Ammon. And they're literally putting the gods on planet Earth as real history. And so when you get to Christianity, they're just following a trend that's already there due to this sort of Socratic rationalism taking over theology. And everyone wants to make everything, it literally happened or else it doesn't matter. And I don't know, I don't know if you can blame the Epicureans for that in a way, because the Epicureans are like they're the more rational ones. Maybe they might have something to do with it too. Maybe it's not just Socrates.
Yeah, that's I would say that's possible. I mean, you could see that whole Democritus and you could see, if you see Democritus as the culmination of like pre-Socratic philosophy, which is kind of hard to call him a pre-Socratic because I think he's born within like a year of Socrates or something like that.
Oh, he's
But
pretty good. He's 6th century, I think, BCE.
oh, he is?
Oh,
Okay.
I'm sorry, 5th century. 5th century.
Okay.
He was born in 460. Let's look it up.
Okay. Yeah, I thought there was some overlap there, but
Oh, there is. He probably was an older chap when Socrates. Oh no, yeah, something like that.
yeah.
No,
So,
you're
but
right. You're right. They're contemporary. You're right.
I guess I would say if you see Democritus as like sort of the culmination of like natural philosophy, because that's really the Socratic turn is taking things like ethical and metaphysical, like predominantly. There doesn't seem to be as much of that concern in Socrates of like determining what nature is, or like the fundamental substance or nature of the elements or anything like that. But if you look at it as Nietzsche does, actually, that culmination of that process is Democritus, who comes to this like mathematized atomism almost. I mean, if you combine him with like the later Pythagoreans, you could kind of have this like mathematized atomistic view of the world, which does seem to be like hyper rationalistic and sort of like opening the door up to Socrates. If you eliminate all of the gods because you've started to treat them with this rationalistic lens, right? There can't really be, Zeus as like this cosmic entity. Maybe he was a king who lived back sometime a long time ago or something like that. It kind of does open the door to like, how do we guide ourselves ethically? How do we conceive of our place as human beings? You can kind of see if you're following a rationalistic tendency, yeah, you would kind of go to some sort of like consequentialist harm reduction sort of ideology, which it does ultimately culminate in Epicurus. You're kind of playing off Democritus. It's something I've been thinking about kind of throughout this conversation. I just pulled up the quote. It's something that Nietzsche says at the beginning of Philosophy in the Tragic Age of the Greeks. But he says, quote, "Whenever philosophy showed itself helping, saving, prophylactic, it was with healthy people. It made sick people still more ill. If ever a nation was disintegrated and but loosely connected with the individuals, never has philosophy bound these individuals closer to the whole. If ever an individual was willing to stand aside and plant around himself the hedge of self-sufficiency, philosophy was always ready to isolate him still more and destroy him through isolation. She is dangerous where she is not in her full right, and it is only the health of a nation, but not that of every nation, which gives her this right," end quote. Which is a really interesting way to look at philosophy. There's always this debate that goes on with how we interpret history, whether it's like, material, which might be like a more Marxist lens, or whether it's more like cultural. You might say it's like a classical conservative lens or something like that, as like the cause. But Nietzsche's almost looking at philosophy as like the result, or maybe it's like a luxury. It's something that you can kind of afford when you're healthy. Like if you're well constituted as a people, if you have your priorities in order, you can do philosophy. You can take that risk of sort of trying to like take on some of that hyper rationalistic tendency. But if you're already in a dissolute place, it's just going to make everything worse. You can't afford the risk of philosophizing. And it's a really interesting way of looking at it because it kind of, I think, transcends that like duality between, like the productions of culture, things like philosophy, or material conditions being the causes. It kind of like it looks at everything as like being basically in Nietzsche's language, like physiological, sort of like a something that's going on the level of like instinct or vitality overall. And philosophy is like it reflects that rather than drives that process, which is very fascinating to me.
Well, it reminds me of today where you can see there's some good philosophy out there. People who engage in philosophy who are pretty good. And you're like, oh, cool. Cool. It's fun to listen to them and hear their thoughts and get their opinions on certain things. And then you get these sort of people that use philosophy for an ends, like Christian philosophers, for example, like the Jay Dyers out there. I'm just going to name them. I don't even care. There's other ones too, like inspiring
People
philosophy.
want me to debate him, and I'm like, what? Why?
That's the debate, everybody, except for me, for some reason. He blocked me for some reason. I
Well,
talked
he
about
hasn't asked me to debate, but that's the one that people always say now. I
oh,
think it would have been
that's what,
somebody
yeah,
different a couple of years ago,
that's what happened.
but
Yeah,
yeah.
everybody, all his, I get comments all the time. Debate Jay Dyer, debate Jay Dyer, and I'm like, I don't care. I'll talk to him. I'm not a debater. I'll talk to him. I don't care. But anyways, these people that use philosophy in sort of a way to sort of like fit Christianity into like the end game. It's complete sophistry. You could just see it. It's like, tag argument. What's his name? I can't remember the guy's name.
Uh,
Doctor
oh, Matt Slick was the tag
Matt
argument guy I
Slick
remember
is
from
one of
back in
them.
the
Oh my
day.
God, yeah, yeah. They have them. It's like they have like checklists. All right, if the person answers the question with this yes or no, here's what you say next. If they say yes, this is what you say. If they say no, this is what you say. And then you get them in the corner. And then using philosophy is a sort of way of like a means to an end. And that's what I think he means by like it makes the sick sicker. Like they are just
Mm.
getting completely sicker with philosophy. It's not they're not getting better. They're not getting enriched by it. They're not being fulfilled by it. They're not gaining anything from it. They're just completely putting themselves deeper into the dogma.
Well, if philosophy is the involuntary confession of its author, as Nietzsche says, then why would it be not the case that your philosophy is just kind of going to kind of reflect the state that you're in and your wants and your desires, your blind spots, your prejudices, and so on and so forth. If we could take actually a brief sidetrack, because I am very interested in bringing up these Christian apologists, not so much in any of them, but I mean, you said you come from a Christian background. Maybe because we are talking about sort of this like rationalist tendency that happens in theology versus maybe a healthier, more sort of, I don't know how we would describe it, a more artful kind of perspective that takes into account artfulness and the human condition and fallibility and perspective and these things. Um, I mean, how do you think about Christianity now, and like, how did your thinking change that like shifted your worldview?
So I grew up in a house that was we were Catholic because my grandma on my mom's side was 100% Italian. So we just she was Catholic. We were all Catholic. That's it. Nobody was religious. Nobody was fundamentalist. Nobody. We went to church on Christmas and Easter, and that was it. Sometimes we'd even miss that. So we were not. It was not like a Christian raising really in that sense. But when I hit really, in my early 20s, late teens, early 20s, I was kind of wild. I was hanging out with the wrong crowd and in dealing with, selling drugs and doing all types of crazy shit. I ended up in prison. And it's funny because Christianity sort of speaks to people who are in really low places. Nietzsche even talks about this. It's for the lowly, it's for the plebs, it's for the sick and the botched. I was
Right.
that person. So
Definitely for the prisoners, man.
yes, I remember I'll never forget the feeling that I got from leaving the unit to go to the church, whatever it was called, the service that was on Sunday. And it was like all of a sudden you go from feeling like you're a loser, you're at the bottom of the barrel, you're all the way, your friends that you went to high school with are all getting jobs, getting PhDs, and you're sitting in prison. You're 20, my 21st birthday, actually. I'm 35 now. So this is years ago when I was in prison. I turned 21 in prison. And like, so like it was, Christianity was calling to me, basically like, no, no, no. Actually, you're chosen. Actually, you were supposed to go through all these things in life. You're the prodigal son. You are the prodigal son.
Mm-hmm.
There's the parable of the prodigal son where he spends all his money on prostitutes and he goes away from his family, and then he comes back and the father rejoices and he's like, "Oh, my son's back." That was speaking to me. So I adopted, because what it did was it immediately gave me power. It immediately made me feel powerful over myself, but also like the world around me. I had the salvation. I had the key to I had the key to heaven. No one else had it but me. All these people that are going to school are getting PhDs. This is all worldly things. They don't even realize they're wasting their time. They should be in church. It gave me immediate power. And so that's how I became a Christian again. And I stayed in Christianity for years after I got out. And I got my life together because of it. I'll even say that today. Christianity did help me get my life together. But then eventually I started to question some of the things. For example, I was going to a King James only church. I don't know if you've ever heard of these.
Kind of. It's kind of a pretty American phenomenon, right?
It is. It is. So the King James only churches are churches that believe that in English, there's only one Bible that's divinely inspired, and that's the King James 1611 Bible. And it was one of those things that I just heard it and go, okay, cool. All right. Anyways, next. Didn't really quit, didn't really care. But then after the years went by, I started to realize this was the most central thing. They care about the King James Bible more than they care about some of the parables. This was like
Right.
central. They would talk about other churches that read the NIV, or they read the NASB, or they were some other, or the Catholics or the Orthodoxes. Oh, they're reading the Nestle Bible. Those Bibles are damned. They're all going to hell. Like, really? People
Really,
up
it goes to that level.
it goes, I swear to God, that goes to that level. I would be like, really? People who don't have a King James Bible are going to hell? Yeah, because this Bible has added, or those Bibles take out verses. And I remember thinking to myself, well, that's crazy. If these Bibles are taking out verses, I want to find out if this is true. So I got my King James Bible and I pull up an NIV Bible and I look at two Bibles, and I look at one of the big examples is 1 John 5:7. First John, the first letter to John, chapter 5 verse or for chapter 5 verse 7. And it says, "For these three are in common, the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." And I'm like, okay, that's what the King James says. And then you look at the NIV and it says, "For there are three in common." And then it stops right there. The second verse is not there. And I'm like, whoa, these people are right about this. They're taking verses out. So then I went deeper and I started to go, well, wait a minute. I want to know what the ancient manuscripts say. I want to know what the Greeks say. What are the oldest manuscripts we can possibly find? What do those say? What are the translations of those say? And I would look these things up, and I found out that it wasn't that they were taking verses out. These modern Bibles were actually reverting back to the original Greek, because the King James had added verses from the Latin side that weren't in the Greek. And
Right.
it's a weird story, but for some reason that knocked off a big stone pillar of my wall of Christianity. And as soon as that fell, all these other sort of pillars started to fall like dominoes, one by one. Because then I realized, okay, this is not true. This church is lying to me, and they really think this is true. They're this dogmatic about something that you can easily look up in 5 minutes. So then I didn't leave Christianity at that point. I went to a Pentecostal church for a while where they do speaking in tongues and that stuff. And I started getting to that stuff because I wanted to get the spirit. I remember just being like,
Mm.
spirit isn't here. I'm going to find the spirit.
You were looking for the Dionysian in the religion, huh?
Exactly. That's what I later figured out. I'm looking for that Dionysian spirit, because that's one of the things they used to do is glossolalia. They used to chant Bacchic chants, ya oh yeah oh oh iwa saba oh. Those are all Bacchic chants, Demosthenes even talks about it in one of his speeches, where he says, you pick up the fat cheek snake and you chant Yao Sabao Yaewa. That's what, like, this was a Dionysian
So
ritual.
they're handling snakes and speaking in
Or
tongues.
snake handling and speaking in tongues. The Dionysians were doing this. And so I
That's
found a
incredible.
church. I know. I found a church that was doing this, and I hung with them for a little while. And then this is a weird story. I told this on my channel before too, but I'll say it here too. One of these days, I was hanging out with the pastor, by the way, at my house, and he was a young guy at my age, and we were just going. I would just like drive this guy crazy with my own like heresy stuff. I'm always asking him questions. And what about these Gnostics? What about this? What about that? Because I'm reading about
What was so wrong with the Albigensians, man?
right. That's what I was doing. I was like driving this guy crazy. And I kept asking him questions about the Gnostics. I kept asking him questions about the Valentinians and what about these people? I'm like, we're speaking in tongues, so are these guys. And I'm like asking him crazy. And he's like, listen, man, I got an idea. When was the last time you were baptized? And I was like, I never got baptized, actually. The church I said you can get spiritually baptized. They didn't even do a baptism. He's like, that's what you need. Why don't we start? He's like, this is so funny. Why don't we set up an entire service just for you next Sunday? It's going to be your baptism. The whole entire church is going to be dedicated to you. I said, let's do it. And I went there and I got baptized. And I remember getting out of the water. And I remember thinking to myself, I don't believe this anymore. It was a,
Oh
it was like,
wow.
it was like the Antichrist took me over and said, "You don't belong here." Because it was like it did the opposite effect. I don't know what happened. I don't know if it was just an awkward moment. It was a weird feeling that I got when I got out of the water, and I remember just being like, "This is weird. I don't believe this anymore." So I left, and that was the last time I ever stepped foot in the church. It was the day
Dude,
I
there
got.
there is something really ironic about that I think Nietzsche would really appreciate, right? Right, of like immersing yourself in water, a kind of an act of like cleansing yourself, and it actually cleansed
Right.
you of the Christianity somehow.
They can't say I
Like
didn't try. They
the
can't say
absolute.
I didn't give my all. Right.
Sure, yeah, true. Well, and also, but so was it just, like a kind of a sense of what would you say, like not feeling anything whatsoever, or
It's just a
was it
sense of
deeper than that?
I know that I don't believe this anymore, and I think there's something else that I need to go find.
Right.
So, and that's sort of where I started to. Then I left the church and started just doing my own thing. Just started believing my own things, and I started really delving into Gnosticism, and the Valentinians were one of these groups that really impressed me. Was the Valentinians, by the way, were one of these early Christian groups they were Pythagorean, like they were
Hmm.
citing Pythagoras in their text. They were giving gematria for Jesus as 888. That's the name of his name in gematria in Greek. But they were also doing like Abraxas and all these other gematrias where Abraxas's name is 365. He represents the cosmos. There's 365 days in a year, and he's the all God. It's the God that you find in Carl Jung's Red Book. And so then I got
Right.
into Carl Jung. That led me to Carl Jung because I started looking up who's Abraxas. Oh, and I find out Carl Jung writes about this guy. So then I started getting into like all these like weird, mystical, Gnostic, Jungian. I went down that pipeline for a little bit, and that's when I started my channel. So I started my channel where I was like flirting with atheism because I was like, I don't know if I believe anything anymore. But I was also like, same time, I was like, no, there's got to be something. So I was like a Jungian on the verge of Jungian Gnosticism and like hardcore agnosticism, like borderline atheism. That's when
Right.
this is around 2001 when I started getting to that point. But yeah,
I so like I guess to that was all fascinating, but I mean to kind of return to the question though, like how do you think about myths or the wisdom of philosophers or religious claims that are made in the Old Testament or the New Testament? Like, do you?
so I'm
I'm
not an
not really
atheist.
asking. I'm not really asking whether you
No,
think
no,
they're
no. It's
objectively true, but
a great
like
question.
what is your engagement with them? Like, on what level are they true, if
So
at all?
I've I've come to the realization I'm not an atheist. Well, my belief about the divine is very close to what Homer would believe in. that there's the inspiration from the muse that we all have, that anybody can attain. A Pindar actually was one of these old poets. Nietzsche talks about Pindar too. We are Hyperboreans. Even Pindar knew that. He says, Pindar says, even the Hyperboreans can get to the muse. Like anyone can attain inspiration from the muse. And I actually believe this 100%. I'm not just LARPing. I actually believe that there's something to the idea of inspiration, and people have something. And the Jung talks about dreams. Even Nietzsche, right? Nietzsche talks about dreams a lot too. But the idea of like humans have some sort of connection with some sort of divine entity that inspires us to do things. Sometimes we don't even know why we're doing things. The idea of free will, I don't really care if we have free will or not. I'm not really a philosopher, but like I do think that there's something that inspires people, and I think there's forces that inspire people to do good art, to make good film, to do good music, and sometimes we don't even know where it comes from. It just
Do you
comes.
do you think that somebody like Jesus even could be inspired?
I think it's possible. I think it's possible that Jesus of Nazareth as a human, as like the historical Jesus, could have been somewhat inspired by some sort of daimonic power. Socrates is daimon or whatever. I also think most of the stories written about him were fabricated later, so it wouldn't even
Hmm.
matter at that point. So,
Right, right, right.
but yeah, no, I think anybody can attain inspiration. That's what I think. I think there's inspiration, and I think there's something divine about that. That's sort of my theology.
Yeah, that's really fascinating because I believe the same thing, but maybe more agnostically even.
Yeah.
Actually, have you ever delved into Michel de Montaigne at all? The
No, I haven't
French Renaissance writer.
heard about
It,
it.
well, when you were talking about Petrarch earlier and Machiavelli, it was making me think of Montaigne because like one of the best things about reading the Renaissance writers is actually if you already are interested in the classics, there's like so much of a wealth of them just talking about the classics. So like every essay Montaigne writes, he's writing kind of essays just reflecting on life and life lessons and meditating on virtue, meditating on being honest and things like that. But
Dante invokes the muses in his trilogy. That
oh right, yeah,
how heretical that is. Dante, the church loves Dante. They don't say he's a heretic, but if you actually read Dante, he's not only is he citing pagan gods in his works like Dispater and Apollo, but he also cites the muses give me inspiration. He says that.
does is that really where we find the origin of the idea of like the virtuous pagans? Is with
Yes,
Dante?
I
Is
think
it
so. I think so. Yeah,
like
Dante's pretty early on, so yeah, that would make sense.
right? So even he has this idea of like, okay, they're not in heaven because they're not saved, they're not redeemed, but the Greek pagans reach the highest zenith possible for human beings just with reason alone.
Right.
And their layer of hell is, it's even kind of described as beautiful. It's like a little bit melancholy, but it's not anything like any of the other layers of hell. So
Yeah,
it's
it's
like
the
it's
highest
in
realm of the underworld. It's the highest realm. Yeah.
right, and it's sort of like it's funny because uh, if you're like anyone who would be reading Dante, you have no chance of getting into that realm of Hades because it's like after Christ has come, so that that's kind of like not possible. But it is like this. He even finds a way to kind of like redeem them without redeeming them in a way,
Yeah.
which is very interesting. But so about Montaigne, which is interesting about him, is that he is also like an agnostic to the point where I almost think that like a true agnosticism almost has nothing to do with atheism in a way. And like I would say, if I had to like categorize my belief according to like classical logic or whatever of like atheism without belief in God, yeah, technically that's the category I fall under. But
Mhm.
really, I think of myself as more of like agnostic to uh, basically any kind of claim about the nature of reality itself. I think it's all sort of beyond, like as Protagoras said, the obscurity of the question and the limitedness of human life makes any answer like impossible.
I agree.
And that's one of the interesting things about Montaigne is he's like a cultural Catholic. He takes the last rites as piously as if he'd never said a doubting word, but all of his writings are basically absolute skepticism to the point where, like, he has written on his library, I do not judge, I do not conclude, I inquire. He really loves Pyrrho and the ancient skeptics, basically.
Yep. Yep.
And so maybe that would be an interesting question, is like, we're using the term agnostic. When you talk about Gnosis and the Gnostics, to what extent do you think there can be like some sort of knowing that transcends rational skepticism, that kind of doubting?
That's because people ask me all the time, are you really a Gnostic? Are you really? I think the Gnostics themselves would have said, I'm not a Gnostic, I'm just a Christian. I think the term doesn't have to have anything to do with Christianity. It's just the idea of rejecting the idea of just blind dogmatic faith in favor of more of a reasonable approach to the divine through knowledge of, knowledge of antiquity, or knowledge of the ancient sources, or knowledge of science, knowledge of music, knowledge of arts. Those things come together, and then the Carl Jung, who a lot of people credit with a whole different branch of Gnosticism, Jungian Gnosticism, has its own name. He was asked the question, do you think there's a God, or do you think there's, what do you think he says? Do you think there's a heaven or something like that? Or do you think God exists? I think. And he says, I don't think, I know. And I was like, that's an interesting answer, because I don't know. Does he really know? I don't think he knows. But I think what he meant by that was, we can look at different parts of the ancient history, or the sources, or poetry, or what, and you can see the divine spark in the classics that make everybody inspired. So why are people still to this day? There's a new Odyssey movie coming out that's going to be filmed by Nolan. Did you hear about this?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So with 2,800 years later, and it's still at the front of pop culture, Homer. That to me is like, Homer did something special. Homer tapped into something that is not normal for people 2,800 years later to be redoing his works for a new audience with the best technology that we can possibly think of. That to me is the idea of knowing, or be going beyond agnosticism, if you will. Because I agree.
So it's like you can see the inspiration, the force of inspiration in the zeitgeist, something like that, of
Yes.
how these great works are continued on.
I agree. Yeah, and but I agree with you at the point where it's like, I do sort of rest in that space between agnosticism and Gnosticism, if that makes sense. I'm not like fully saying I know for sure because God speaks to me or something like crazy like that. But I'm also keeping myself open to this idea, and I think it's a more healthier worldview in the end. At the end, I could see the positives of people being pious or religious in some ways. Where, for example, burial of loved ones. When a family buries their dead, they always appeal to religion, and I can see why, because it's a tough. What else do you do? And I could see this is why I could see why ancestral worship was such a big deal in the ancient world, because you knew you were going to be a part of that line. You knew all the. Let's say, for example, you had a catacomb at your local Germanic village where all the skulls of your ancestors were all placed in there, and it goes back for like 1,000 years. I'm just making this up, and you knew that that's where you're going to end up, and you're going to be a part of something bigger than yourself. There's something comforting about that. So I look at it like maybe I am sort of like pushing myself to believe more than I actually do, but at the same time, I'm also trying to keep it like as rational as possible. I'm trying to go to the middle ground. I'm sort of trying to balance between the Apollonian and Dionysian, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, that makes perfect sense, and it also, it's funny because it calls to mind several things. I mean, what you're describing with the sort of like death rituals, that goes all the way back to archaic Greece. It was making me think of the fact that not only are all your ancestors buried on your land, and then you conceive of them as like spirits who are watching over you, and
Right.
kind of guarding it. But then you have a hearth fire that never goes out, that
Right.
you tend, and then you're like raising your kid to tend it, and you tell him how his great grandfather was tending the same fire. And that fire is a god. And so that's like a living kind of symbol of the continuity that you're a part of. And that is very comforting. And it made me think of a passage in Human All Too Human where Nietzsche, I think he directly references Machiavelli and says, this is why Machiavelli said, no matter how ambitious the state is or the prince running the state, he should never really tamper with the domestic religion because the state can never comfort the heart of like a family whose child dies in war the way that a religion can. And so it's even he's looking at it almost from a cynical standpoint, but it's because it's such a it's like an obvious fact. Like it has this utility. But then what that brings my mind to is, Nietzsche kind of when he's addressing his free spirits, it's something that I've thought about as well of like, yeah, just being committed to a religious worldview, just accepting a myth and saying, I'm just gonna live my life according to this. It's kind of
Yeah.
what Montaigne said you should do because he was so agnostic. He said, what's my reason to doubt the truths that I've been handed down? Right? I'm just going to follow
Right.
the
Right.
religion of my fathers. But, and there's times where it almost seems like Nietzsche might agree with something like that. But when he's really talking to his free spirits, he's cautioning his readers, hey, that feels really good to believe and it has all these social benefits, but that doesn't make it true.
Right.
And there's a way in which he's trying to like, he's really hoping that he can talk to somebody who's like, the way he puts it is strong enough. It's not like you're rational enough. Are you courageous enough to not live with that anchor, or we might say like guardrails or something like that on your
Yes.
worldview? And
Yeah,
so,
because
like for me, I waver between those two things as well for that reason.
yeah, it was well said because you can read Nietzsche and he'll pop out at you and say it's almost like he'll say it almost comes off atheistic very much sometimes, especially in the Antichrist, like I mentioned earlier when he talks about this whole idea of heaven. Why should we care? Why should we end our lives now for a new life and the next life when this is heaven right here? Let's make this that can be perceived as very atheistic as saying like all that matters is right now and right now is all that matters. But you almost like you said, you have the guts to accept that. But like you said though, you mentioned the hearth fire, and this was such a good point you brought up because the Romans, they had this idea, they had this system of manes, or they called them spirits of the dead, they called them, but there's a Latin
Or
word for
like Penates.
genius.
Oh, genius. Yeah.
Where we get
Okay.
the
Yeah.
genie from, genius. And these were ancestral spirits that were buried in catacombs that would go back all the way to your familial hearth would be there. But they also had like the main sacred fire in the Roman Forum that was set up in the 7th century BCE by the Roman king Numa Pompilius. And it stayed lit. It never went out ever, all the way until 391 CE when Theodosius, the Christian emperor, banned pagan worship and had the flame extinguished.
Wow.
Isn't that crazy?
I didn't know that. I never thought about that of like when did the
1,000
Vestal fire go out?
literally over 1,000 years, and they put it
And
out.
and they put it out. It's not because, the Gauls didn't come in and like put out the fire to destroy Rome. They ultimately did it to themselves, right? They made the choice. We no longer believe this.
Theodosius made the decree. He was the imperator. It was his decision.
All right, they were a minority, right? Christianity was not a majority religion at the time.
Oh, even at that point in time. So when Constantine gets in power, Christianity's the estimates are 5 to 10%. So that 9 out of 10 people are still pagans, all the way in the 4th century. This is only 60 years before they extinguished the fire. By the time they get to that point in time, you can think it probably would have risen substantially by then, but not even close to 50%. Maybe at 40 at the most, but I think most scholars would say between 25 and 35%. So
That's incredible.
you're still, most people are pagan. They're probably freaking out about this, but they really took over.
And how far off are we from like Odovaker? What is that, like 70 years, something like that?
That's what I was. Isn't that crazy? How within a century, not even a century later, Rome falls. And guess you know what's even crazier about this? I hate this. This is gonna sound like I'm like a full blown pagan here, but like when Rome according to the sources, in 200 BC, the Sibylline oracle told the Romans to go and get this statue of Magna Mater from Asia Minor, and if they did this and they set up a temple to her, then they would be victorious, and they would take over the whole entire eastern realms of the Mediterranean, which happens. And
Right.
it's so crazy how that works. Now you think, did it happen because they did this, or did this process spark something within them to make it happen? Right? Did it like force them to make it happen? Who knows? Right? But
So Machiavelli in his discourses on Livy talks about this, where he basically
that's
talks about how they used prophecies to like motivate themselves. Basically, like where a random happenstance would lead a Roman augur to interpret it as we're going to win this battle, and then they would against all odds.
that's the book that I was mentioning earlier when I was saying how, yes, and he praises this whole system of like it gives people something to like get inspired by. So it actually is magic in a way. You're actually affecting reality. You're affecting the outcomes of how people are going to act by doing these acts of worship and these acts of rituals. And that flame going out in 391, I would literally posit in my own personal hypothesis that this had a lot to do with Rome falling. Because what, like,
Wouldn't that, yeah, that would demoralize the entire
demoralize,
population that's still pagan, the majority of the people.
and they have nothing. What do they have to fight for? Their ancestral hearth is gone.
Well, can I, if I could quote or not quote, but just paraphrase really quick something that's in Fustel de Coulanges' book, The Ancient City, just to get across how seriously the Romans took this. There was an incident in the, I think, Middle Republic, where some foreigners got a little bit close to the Vestal fire. And the consul gave a speech and was basically like, I think they were spies trying to put out our fire. Nothing actually happened. There was very like kind of sketchy proof of this, but they had all these people executed. And
Right.
one of the things he says in his speech is, as we all know, the surest way to destroy a people like ourselves would be to put out our sacred fire. That's what they literally believed, is like our life force, our chance of survival is tied to this fire. So then a Christian emperor comes in and puts it out. I mean, I'm trying to think of what an equivalent would be in a Christian society. It would be like, I don't know what, like, the Antichrist takes over in modern times, right? And they start marking everyone with the mark of the beast around you. That would probably
Right.
demoralize you. You'd be like, well, if you're a Christian, you'd be like, this is the end times. There's nothing I can do.
Yeah, like the Vatican is just completely annihilated by a nuclear bomb or something, and like there's no more Vatican, there's no more Pope. Like imagine that. What would that do to Catholics? They're done. You have
Right.
nothing. There's nothing to, or like Islam, Mecca is just destroyed, and the cube is gone, and there's nothing there. Like that would demoralize everybody.
Right.
Um,
There would be some sects that would have like some kind of explanation for it. I guarantee you, but it would be like a huge psychological like. There would be people who would be like, "Oh, this can't be the truth. There's no way God would let Mecca be destroyed."
yeah, they shut down the Olympic Games. They shut down. Converted the libraries over to just Christian libraries. Shut down all the temples, the Eleusinian mysteries, which was literally open before even written history even began. Like Plutarch talks about, the Eleusinian mysteries are older than Rhodes. That's how old the Eleusinian mysteries were. They shut that down. Everything gets shut down. And that's the end of antiquity. That the Theodosius between Theodosius and Justinian, double-handedly, I'd say, shut down antiquity. Like ended antiquity, and it's
Yeah,
like
and
Dark Ages.
I guess to maybe bring this around to like kind of a final topic of discussion, then that's a big thing that Nietzsche focuses on, is sort of what we've lost in the pagan world, which it's more than maybe the historical phenomenon of Dionysian cults, but Dionysus becomes like a code word for whatever it was that was like vital and life affirming in the pagan
And for
religions.
good reason. For good reason, because Dionysus is so prevalent. When you start reading through not just Greek sources but Latin sources, when you start reading, Martial and Virgil and Plautus and Menander, Ovid, Virgil, Livy, Lucian, Cicero, all of them are constantly referencing Dionysus, and he's just the god of epiphany, how he's this god of life, and how he's this, this very like bright and cheerful god. He's in our ceremonies, Dionysus is with us, and there's Dionysus is central. He's not just one of the 12 Olympian gods. And then Apollo also in a lot of these older, like Pindar is big into Apollo. Archilochus is big into Apollo. Apollo is also very central to a lot of these hymns and epodes and odes and stuff like that. So for good reason, he uses the term Dionysian or Apollonian.
Yeah, and I think the way I understand that kind of the central importance of both of them is that Nietzsche talks about how Dionysus isn't even just a Greek phenomenon. He thinks the Dionysian happened in the festival of Psyche in Babylon. And we have the legend of Dionysus when he's kind of in exile. I think he gets cursed by Hera and he loses his memory, and he's kind of adopted by Cybele, who's this Eastern, like Lydian goddess of the earth. And I've heard a theory that really they never adopted Cybele because they already had Gaia, they already had Persephone. But Dionysus, the way, kind of the procession that he comes in with, like of like tigers and flute playing and drumming, it all like kind of bears the mark of that like Cybele worship.
Oh yeah, and that's the Strabo. If you read Strabo, he's one of these geographers from the Augustan period. He wrote in Greek, and that's exactly what he says. He says the Dionysian and the Cybelian are the same thing. He says they are literally the same thing. They are the ecstasy of the flute playing, of the drums, of the orgy, and that's what he literally says. Those are two things that are part of the same thing. He says that the Phrygians influenced the Athenians just as much as the Thracians influenced the Athenians, and that's what he gets at.
Yeah, and so like in Nietzsche's claim, which to me it seems a little dubious, but it's the way he understood it, is like the Dionysian overwhelmed past societies. Like in Psyche at Babylon, it led to so much like social dissolution and depravity they couldn't handle it. Historically, is that accurate? We can put that to one side, but I think it's so brilliant his understanding of how the Greeks basically absorbed the Dionysian. It's through Apollo. It's they basically. Apollo is the god of boundary lines, and sort of Greek tragedy is that boundary. It's the magic circle where you can contain the total breakdown of like your individual personal self and like experiencing the primordial pain and contradiction, as Nietzsche calls it. That kind of ecstatic, what does he say? The witch's brew of violence and sexuality. This return to the state of nature in a way. But it's the Apollonian is kind of what contains it, and it like renders it into an image. It's because of Apollo that the Greeks understand Dionysus. Because if you think of Dionysus as like self-consciousness destroying, then in a way you can't really have an experience of it or memory or understanding of it. It's only if you have some way of like representing that, which is what Apollo gives them.
I just want to comment on that real quick. Is that the author of Saturnalia, Macrobius, who's a late antiquity writer, actually says that Dionysus and Apollo are the same god.
Oh, wow.
He gives all these arguments for it, and he actually pulls up Orphic hymns, and he pulls out lines from Homer, and he actually makes a case. And in the book Saturnalia, I think it's right off the bat, like one of the first two books of Saturnalia, he literally makes the case that Dionysus and Apollo are the same god. They're two heads of one god. I don't know if Nietzsche was just drawn from that or if he's drawn from other places, but also in archaeology in Athens, they pulled out the archaeologists found a calendar. No, I'm sorry, in Delphi. They found this calendar from Delphi. And by the way, Delphi, I don't know if you know this, the top of Delphi was a sanctuary to Apollo.
That's right. It's like Apollo's the one who speaks through the Sibyls, I guess.
And so but guess who's on the bottom of the mountain? Was a grave where Dionysus was buried. So there was was a dead grotto. It was called the Grotto of Dionysus. It's at the bottom. You can still visit it there. I don't know if it's really a grave there, but like the site's still there, where it's the people who would go there. They would see a grave dedicated to Dionysus, and then they would walk up the mountain, and then they would go get the oracle from Apollo. So you have the dead Dionysus and the living Apollo in this sanctuary. And then at that location, archaeologists found a calendar and the calendar was marked half the year Dionysus rules, the other half of the year Apollo rules. And Apollo, according to, I can't remember what source it is. I think it is Pindar actually, where they say that during the years during the 6 months that Dionysus is ruling, which are the winter, the cold months, Apollo goes up to the north to the Hyperboreans and he plays his lyre for them, and that's why you see the aurora borealis.
Oh, wow.
So the idea, so Nietzsche wasn't just making up an Apollonian Dionysian and applying it backwards. He was drawing from real sources from antiquity. He was doing real classical philology.
Right. Well, and I guess what unites those two gods? I mean, what's coming to my mind, like if we just think philosophically, in a way, it's like they're concerned with mankind in some way, because Apollo is the god who's giving us prophecy and sort of the god of the plastic arts, the god of the archery, sculpting, all of these
They're both
things. The
they're
lyre.
both gods of inspiration.
Oh, yeah, that's a great
So
point.
one of them is inspiring you through the oracle, and the other one's inspiring you through intoxication. So it's dreams and intoxication.
Right, which is interesting because from Nietzsche's later philosophy, and this is why I kind of reject a lot of people. You kind of brought this up at the beginning, but just to say it explicitly, like, yeah, I agree with you. I kind of reject this idea that Nietzsche's philology and his philosophy are disconnected, because you can see even there, Nietzsche's really fascinated by the prospect that art itself comes from this like mytho-religic or religious origin. And well, what kind of world does Nietzsche believe in? He believes in a physical world, a physiological world. So he looks for these two physiological states that kind of create this ability to be inspired, which is not necessarily to be like materialistic and reductive, because he's still like Schopenhauerian at that time. He's into like all these kind of, I mean, you could say they're really out there theories about like the world being all one will, this blind force of willing and desiring that we simply, all of the separation and individual phenomena are just our representations on it, which is also very fascinating. You could see Dionysus as like the will and Apollo as the faculty of representation. So there's like a Schopenhauerian thing in the way he interprets them. But
Yeah.
that like the lasting impact, I think, is like trying to trace the physiological roots. And he asks the question, could mass hallucinations strike whole cultures where they all hallucinate the same thing? Is that what was going on at these Eleusinian mysteries? Is that possible?
It's possible, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you wouldn't know unless you put yourself in that state. Have you ever read the book The Secret History? That's Donna Tartt tells this. It's like a fictional novel, but the main plot point is these college kids try to recreate a Dionysian like Eleusinian mystery, and they end
Yeah.
up like murdering somebody over the course of doing it like on accident, and like it's kind of a Greek tragedy in a way. But
Damn.
they talk about that they had to like recreate every last aspect of it. And I think I've seen some footage of people trying to recreate what Greek tragedy was like, because that was part of the Dionysia. And the masks, and it's like it's an entirely different kind of acting than we think about like acting today. You're not really trying to like you're not trying to give like an artful distinct performance. You're trying to like be immersed in this character and make
Right.
the audience like identify you as that character, even against their better judgment in some way. And so I think, yeah, I do wonder about that, of when there were all these masked actors on stage and everyone is like intoxicated, and maybe in like the earliest renditions of these Dionysian tragedies, when Dionysus is
Satire
still the
chorus.
main character.
The
You know,
satire chorus would come out and sort of make fun of everything. That's like the where we get the word satire from.
right? Yeah, yeah, and like very interesting. They're like half man, half goat. These divine beings who live beyond all the turning of history. Basically,
They
they're
take nothing
eternally the
seriously.
same.
They take nothing seriously too. They're all just like horny all the time and just kind of drunk and horny, and like that's like the satyr is like this primal energy, pure primal energy. But they use them in these plays to sort of come out and do a chorus and sort of lighten up the mood a little bit.
Well, I think Nietzsche actually calls it tragicomic in the final analysis, in a way. That there is, I love the way he talks about Oedipus at Colonus, where he says what Sophocles is telling us in this play is that the noble man is without sin, in spite of everything bad that's happened to Oedipus. That you could say was brought about by his own making. Maybe he's stubborn. Maybe he had hubris, but ultimately it was like his fate. He was fated for this end to be, to commit incest, to commit parricide. And yet, at the end, even though he's like this blinded, disgraced old man, there becomes like a big. I thought of this earlier when you were talking about the Romans going to take this relic from the east, right? They would do this where they would try and steal relics from competing cities because the bones of like I think the Spartans tried to steal the bones of Theseus,
Yeah.
and so the idea that wherever Oedipus dies, there will be sort of like a magical aura or
That's what happened with
magical.
Alexander the Great. You
Right.
know,
Yeah. There's like a but it's interesting in the context of that tragedy, right? Is that like the way Nietzsche interprets it is like there's like a superordinate cheerfulness. It's not cheerfulness in the sense of optimism of everything's going to be okay. It's a sort of like elevation of the whole thing into beauty and like a sort of like a blessing on it, which is a very profound thing to do if you see that tragedy as like a reflection of your existence of the human condition. If that is tragic, blessing that tragedy.
yeah, and I think the Gospels are drawing from that too. I think because the Gospels are kind of tragedies in their own right, especially Mark. Mark's the first one written, and the earliest version of Mark that the of the manuscripts that we have actually doesn't even have the part where he comes back. So he just
Mm,
dies. The women go to the tomb and they're crying, and the angel was like, "Don't worry, he's risen," and then it ends. It's like, wait, you
right.
don't even get to see him. He doesn't even get to come. It's like a tragic ending. So I think, a lot of people have
That's
written that.
almost like the Deus Ex Machina, right? The
Yeah.
angel, like the way Euripides, what Nietzsche criticized Euripides for as an actor, because that was like a literal machine. You like
Yes.
lower the actor into the, so an angel just shows up, tells you what happened, and that's the end.
That's exactly what it. And see, what you just said has been written about by a bunch of scholars.
Really? Okay, I didn't even know. I didn't know that.
Yeah, that's exactly what they point out. And John is like the total Dionysian gospel, according to a lot of these scholars. That it's like literally riffing off of Bacchae, and John, Jesus and John is called the true vine. He is, born from the bosom of the Father, where Dionysus comes from the lap of Zeus. A lot of that stuff. But anyways, yeah, the Gospels are definitely drawing from that sort of tragic with a slant. I shouldn't say. I should say
Right.
there's a tragic slant going on.
Well, it shows their cultural influence. They're kind of breathing in the oxygen of Hellenization.
Yeah.
And in spite of the fact that it might be a completely different sort of message, or like Nietzsche would say, it turns the worldview on its head.
Yeah,
But it's still,
it's like it's targeting those Greeks, but it's also trying to flip the morality. The morality gets flipped, but the culture still there.
yeah, man, I could talk to you about this stuff for probably 3 more hours, but I
Yeah,
guess to kind of wrap it up as a final question, then, when this is kind of what I was getting at earlier of the kind of bringing up the Dionysian. If we have, well, for one, I guess I'll ask. Maybe it's a two-part question. Do you agree with Nietzsche that we have lost that? That there's been something that's been excised or suppressed in our society by Christianity? I think I know your answer, but I guess I wonder your exact read on it. And then, like, what do you have any thoughts on what does it mean to recapture that, or how do we reconnect with that? Is it something we even need to reconnect with?
yeah, I agree. Pretty much yes to all that. I think not only have we lost that aspect. First of all, I agree with Nietzsche 100% that this is like a vital aspect of people even wanting to live at all. Like, what's the purpose to life without a god of life, right? Dionysus, right? And I actually think it's coming back naturally from people sort of like we live in a world now that Nietzsche lived in, he lived up until 1900. So that's still a world where Christianity still sort of the cultural dominance at that time period, even though he was able to speak freely against it, which was, cool, whatever. But now we live in a time period where more and more people aren't really going to church anymore. And we have a whole new set of music and film and art that's out there. Like you're a musician, right?
Yeah, yeah. I actually have an album called "The Ever Living Fire," which is a reference to Heraclitus.
Nice. And so that that alone right there will naturally just bring the Dionysian back into the play, I think. I don't think you have to force it. I don't think you need to set up some sort of dogma to get it there. I think people being free to do art, people being free to do music, people being free to make films, that's going to bring back that sort of Dionysian spirit, a sort of spirit of life, which I think is, if I don't know if you agree with me, would you say in the last 50 years that the sort of the Dionysian is sort of creeping back into the mainstream?
I think it is. It's funny because I had a conversation with my friend Craig on his podcast Acid Horizon about this, and one of the things that I kind of it was actually something that just came to me spontaneously when we were talking about it because he was like, "What would we need to have a Dionysian resurgence?" Because it's like I do see that like the false dawn of it almost, right? It's like you could see
Yeah.
the brimming of it over the horizon, but I think there's an element of like self consciousness in our society today. I think that's a big thing that Christianity, you could say, gave us, but it's also something that Nietzsche would say, like, kind of damages us in a way. It's like the inability to forget, the inability to. That's the whole problem with resentment, right? You get harmed by somebody and you like hold on to it, or like guilt, which is cruelty turned back inward. But that's guilt is like the memory of your own actions that you can't let go of. So there's like a really deep way that Christianity is really tied to like being conscious of yourself.
And
And
sin, the idea of sin, right?
right, that's really what sin is
Yeah.
sin and self-consciousness kind of go hand in hand, whereas like the Dionysian has an element of like self-forgetting. And so I do worry that in the modern world where everything is sort of public facing, everyone's very concerned with their public image and profile, it's very hard to like let go of yourself. You could do
Yeah.
it in certain social contexts, like I play in a heavy metal band, so there's like an element of the Dionysian in that, right?
Right. Right.
But like a truly orgiastic ritual or something like that. I'm not saying we need to go back to that, but if we ever did, you can't be having people walking around filming it on their iPhones. Like it
Right.
can't be about that, and people can't be like concerned about that. I think there's something about like secrecy in old religions and in cults that's actually really valuable.
Yeah.
That might make it difficult. And there is something about that lack of secrecy that is like in a way Christian, or you might call it like hyper Christian, right? It's very universalist. You know, if you're living like in a monastery communally, you shouldn't be like keeping secrets from your abbot and off doing your own thing. You know, like everybody, you should be
You're
always be willing to give the explanation for your faith, for the hope that you have, or whatever. There's something that's very like it's confessional, right? Be vulnerable, be confessional. So I'm wondering if there's certain ways that might even be unconscious to us, or like that are not immediately obvious, that our society's been Christianized in a way that could be like hostile to the Dionysian.
what you just said just made a lot of sense to me that I'm going to take with me after this because I'm actually going to Greece to visit with a new temple of Pan.
Oh yeah, I wanted to ask you about that too. So that's
Yeah,
perfect. Yeah.
it's perfect time to bring it up actually because I want to talk to these revivalist movement over in Greece right now. I'm going to be doing this the next 3 weeks after this. I'm going to be filming and doing a documentary about these people in Greece who are reviving the old traditional polytheistic rites. And I want to talk to them. I want to get to know them, and I want to. And actually, I'm talking to people in the states too, who someone I know right now who's looking to purchase an old church that has Ionic columns and revamp it into a temple to the Muses.
Oh
And so,
wow, that's
and
amazing.
what you said about secrecy is actually, I think, is important because if we're going to sort of draw from the playbook of the ancients, the Eleusinian mysteries was what happened there was secret. And that's why we
Right.
don't know. That's why we don't have any sources that tell us really went down. Very few, because the people who were initiated didn't tell anybody what happened. But those people, because Euripides was an initiate, Aeschylus was an initiate, Sophocles was an initiate, Plato was an initiate. They all were initiates, and they would go on and go and write their works or do their plays and do their philosophies, and they would get seep into the world. And the Dionysian would get out into the exoteric would get seeped from the esoteric. So I think
Mm.
having those centers out there is going to be crucial. But you're right; it's not going to be a place that's open for everybody because it's not meant for everybody.
Right. Well, and there's something about passing judgment in that way, which in theory Christians aren't supposed to do that, but that's kind of the funny thing about it, right? Like you kind of
Ironic, yeah.
right, yeah, and like it's the way Nietzsche talks about Christianity is like an inner dance of both guilt and pride. because you end up
Yes.
taking pride in how guilty you are, how aware you are of your own guilt and things like that. And so I think a lot of that gunk is still in our heads, and even in totally secular people. The way that you see, I mean, without getting too modern or political about it, but the way people on social media will do kind of, the term virtue signaling or whatever, or
Yes.
calling people out on like a moralistic crusade. That's all very Christian in a way.
Oh, it reminds me of like the old. If you read about these old Christians from like the fourth century, fifth century, they would go on pillars and they would stand on pillars for months, and they would have like their family feed them every day, and they would sit on a pillar and go, "Look how great of a Christian I am, everybody! I dropped out of society, and I'm just going to sit here all day because I'm just going to devote my life to God." And it was forever. It was in the middle of the public square. You would have Christians who would just sit on a pillar in front of everybody and then just to show off. It was virtue signaling. And
Right.
these are
Pillar signaling. Yeah.
pillar signaling. And you can see it today. It's so embedded in our culture. Oh, look at me. I'm going to make a video on YouTube of me feeding a poor guy. Oh, look, Mr. Beast just bought a homeless guy a new apartment. That's such a Christian thing right there. That's so Christian.
Yeah, there's something about saying this is the truth for us, for our initiates, or we don't need the whole world to be on our level or to see things the way that we do. And that in fact, that might even be contrary to our end. Like that, that's very anathema to modern religion. And I mean, as Nietzsche said, there's very little distinction between philosophy and religion at the end of the day. It's actually one of the things I like about your channel, by the way, is that you kind of look at philosophers in a kind of as mystical figures, or almost like through the lens of myth sometimes, and you look at
Yeah.
religion philosophically, and I love that a lot. So yeah, I guess we'll wrap it up here. I mean, if there's anything you want to shout out, I think everyone should definitely keep an eye out for your film. I'm definitely going to be very excited to see that. Is there anything you wanted to say at the end? Just anything else that you're working on, or message for my audience,
Yeah.
your audience, anybody?
I guess I'll just give a little rundown of what's going to happen in the next 3 weeks when I leave for Greece. I'll be in Athens for 10 days. I'm going to film the Acropolis, the Parthenon, that little area right there. And then I'm going to go down to Arcadia for maybe another week or something like that, 5 to 7 days to go talk with these people that are in Arcadia that are up to set up this temple of Pan, get their thoughts. I've already been talking to them back and forth. They seem like awesome people. They're like you and me, like they're on the same page as us, basically about worldview and stuff like that. After I go there, I'll visit Mycenae. I'll visit the temple of Asclepius and Epidaurus, famous temple of where the healings went down. And then I'm going to go to the temple of Poseidon, the famous temple of Poseidon, Delphi. Already, I'll hit Eleusis when I'm in Athens. It's right there. And then I'm going to finish off the last 4 days in the Cyclades Islands, and then fly
Oh
back.
wow.
So I'm going to get
Where are you most excited to go at all these sites? I know it's hard to choose.
most excited to talk to the people from the Sanctuary Pan in Arcadia.
Okay, wow.
I cannot wait to talk to these people. They're going to let me stay at their temple complex, and I'm going to, interview a few people there and get their thoughts. I even have an interview lined up with one of the Catholic, or not Catholic, one of the Orthodox local priests who's against it. I want to talk to him and go, why are you against it? What's the big deal? I want to get his thoughts.
Right, right, right. Well, I mean, they're dragging him back to paganism, brother.
And they got him arrested. This guy Bexis, they got him arrested, but he's on bail right now. But my whole plan of going there is to film as much as possible. Even one of the people I know there is going to let me take me on a ride in a helicopter to get.
What is it, like blasphemy laws, like something like that, or how did they get him arrested?
They originally were like protesting it and saying you're bringing people back to idolatry, blah blah blah. But then they found some like statute of how he built this temple that was illegal. Like
Wow.
they like dug into they got some lawyers together and they found something he did in his temple that wasn't up to building code or something crazy like that, and they got him on that.
That's the pettiest way to.
Isn't
Come
it?
on.
Isn't it crazy how that works? So I'm gonna get to the bottom of that and figure out exactly what happened. But that's what I know so far. But yeah, my whole point is to film as much as possible, and I'm gonna come back and make a documentary about ancient Greece, the classical period, sort of the tragic age like Nietzsche writes about, and then compare it to the Dark Ages, and then sort of go, what did we lose? It's sort of like the aim of my documentary is to show people, look, we have a rich heritage that we all have claim to. It doesn't matter if you're not Greek. Like Pindar even says the muse is even with the Hyperboreans. He says that this tradition of the muse, like we lost it, and this is, I don't know. I want to get people to realize that.
That all sounds great. I will definitely watch. I will definitely share that when it comes out. Neal, thank you so much for your time, man. It's been a pleasure.
It's been a pleasure on my end too. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. Cheers, everybody. Signing off.
If you enjoyed the Nietzsche podcast or found it helpful, you can visit us and support the show at patreon.com/untimely-reflections. The link is in the description. Or just share the show with any of your friends that you think might enjoy it or on social media. Thank you for your support.